On the morning of January 19th, 1892, a young man named Edwin Brown was unable to get out of bed. His throat was covered with 2 rows of pinpoint wounds, fresh and surrounded by yellowish streaks of broken capillaries, as if something small but strong had been pressed against the skin many times in a row in one night. Family physician Harold Stevens recorded in his journal that the young man had lost at least 2 pints of blood over an unspecified period, and that the source of the bleeding could not be explained pathologically. I held this document in my hands in the reading room of the Vatican's reliquary archives, in a section accessible only by written request through the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. The folder marked Secretum Pontificium contained the diary of the Reverend John Hubert Watson, parish priest of St. Michael's Church in Exeter, Rhode Island. The diary was sealed with a silver clasp shaped like a Latin cross and wrapped in linen soaked in something like vinegar mixed with ash. These weren't storage measures, they were containment measures. The Brown family had been fading since 1888. The mother, Mary Eliza Brown, died first in December of that year. Then the eldest daughter, Mary Olive, died 8 months later in 1888. Doctors recorded the same clinical picture: progressive emaciation, night sweats, coughing up blood, and rapid weight loss. The official diagnosis was the same in every case: pulmonary consumption, tuberculosis, the scourge of New England in that century. The Providence authorities were satisfied with this explanation, and I have no doubt they preferred to remain satisfied with it for as long as possible. In January 1892, the third daughter, Mercy Leve Brown, fell ill. She was 19 years old. The illness progressed rapidly, even by the standards of what doctors called rapid consumption. She died on January 18th. She was buried in the Exeter Baptist Church Cemetery the following day, in frozen ground, at temperatures around 8 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. Reverend Watson personally performed the funeral service and closed the coffin. That same night he kept vigil at the bedside of Edwin, the only surviving son of the Brown family, who had been visibly declining for 3 weeks. The room was small, with 1 window facing north and 1 door leading to the common hallway. Watson sat at the head of the bed with a Bible on his lap. According to his entry, it was around 2 in the morning when he noticed the lower gap in the front door. Fog had begun to seep through the crack between the door and the floor. Watson wrote that he initially thought it was a draft carrying vapors from the nocturnal swamp which lay a 1/4 mile to the east. But the fog didn't move like vapor. It didn't dissipate. It thickened. It flowed along the baseboard with a purposefulness the Reverend described as meaningful. It crept toward the bed, toward Edwin. Watson stood up. He describes the temperature in the room dropping sharply within seconds, so much so that his breath became visible. The candle on the bedside table didn't go out, but its flame shrank to the size of a pinhead and turned blue. The fog continued to thicken at the foot of the bed, taking on a vertical form. The last thing Watson recorded in his journal about that night was the following: a smell appeared in the room. He described it as the scent of damp earth and something sweet and nauseating, similar to the scent of flowers left to rot in stagnant water. He already knew that smell. He'd heard it 18 hours ago, standing by the open casket and reading the last prayers over Mercy Brown's body. The fog had ceased to be fog. It had happened without warning, without build-up, without the smoothness that folklore ascribes to such phenomena. Watson recorded that the compaction took no more than 3 seconds. The amorphous mass simply took shape, as if an invisible hand were squeezing it from within. First, the outline of shoulders and a head appeared, then arms hanging down at her sides. Then a face. It was the face of Mercy Brown. The Reverend knew it well. He baptized her 19 years ago, married her parents, and confessed her shortly before her death. He saw this face in the coffin 18 hours ago, waxen and motionless. What now stood at the foot of Edwin's bed had the same features, The same contoured cheekbones, the same small nose with slightly flared nostrils. But the resemblance ended where the details began. The creature's skin was white, not the white of a sick person or a dead person. Watson chose a specific comparison, which appears twice in his diary on 2 different pages, as if he were returning to it to verify its accuracy. He wrote that the skin was white, like leached bone from which the fat had been boiled. No pink undertones. No blueness of asphyxiation, simply an absence of blood beneath the surface, as if it had never been there. The hair, light brown in life, now seemed almost gray, though the light in the room was dim, and Watson conceded he could be mistaken about the shade. He was right. The hair was dry. Absolutely dry, even though the creature had just materialized from the damp fog. The eyes were open. Watson described them carefully because they were what kept him awake later. The iris was completely missing. It didn't turn white or cloudy, as happens in corpses with decomposed corneas. It was absorbed by the pupil. The entire visible eye from edge to edge was a solid black surface, matte, without glare, without the reflection of a candle. Watson wrote that looking into those eyes was like looking through 2 holes punched in a wall, with nothing behind them. The lips were red, not pale like a corpse, and not painted like a society lady's. They were intensely red, unnaturally, wetly red. On the lower lip, near the right corner of the mouth, was a small dark streak, already dry at the edges. Watson, who had no knowledge of forensic terminology, described it simply: a trace of blood that the creature had failed to lick off, or that it had intentionally left as a mark. The creature had not moved. It stood and looked at Edwin. The boy was asleep, or in that state that looks like sleep from the outside but is something deeper and more violent. Its breathing was slow, with long pauses between inhalations and exhalations, which Watson silently counted, and which lasted up to 8 seconds. The creature tilted its head to the side, watching him, and in this gesture there was something reminiscent of a bird of prey, assessing its prey from a branch. The angle was slightly greater than normal neck anatomy would allow. Watson lifted the cross. He wore it constantly, on a leather cord under his collar, a simple silver crucifix blessed at St. Michael's Church. He pulled it out and held it out in front of him, standing between the creature and the bed. He said he didn't utter any formula. He simply raised the cross and called out the Lord's name. The reaction was immediate and physical. The creature recoiled, as if pressure had built up between it and the crucifix. He didn't recoil metaphorically, but physically, losing his balance, his feet sliding back on the floor a few inches. Then his face changed. Watson spent the most lines in this diary entry describing this change. The features that had been recognizable as Mercy Brown a moment ago seemed to blur beneath the skin. The cheekbones became sharper and higher. The nose narrowed. The corners of the mouth drooped and stretched. Watson used the word grimace, but immediately crossed it out and wrote distortion over it. He clarified that it wasn't an expression of pain or anger in the human sense, but rather a structural change in the facial muscles, as if another face were beneath the skin and had briefly emerged. The creature opened its mouth. Watson noted that the canines were elongated, approximately twice their normal length, with sharp conical tips, and that the gums around them were dark, almost black, with no signs of inflammation or necrosis. These weren't the rotten teeth of a dead animal. They were the working anatomy of a predator. Watson described the sound the creature emitted as a hiss. Not the sound of a human throat, but the sound of air escaping under pressure from a narrow opening. He wrote that the sound contained no component that could be interpreted as speech or communicative intent. It was a reflexive response to a stimulus, like the hiss of an animal whose path to food has been blocked. Then the creature disintegrated. It didn't fall. It didn't retreat into a corner. It simply began to lose shape from the bottom up, as if its flesh was ceasing to be flesh, starting with its feet. 2 seconds later, the room was filled with fog again. A second later, the fog flowed back toward the door, toward the crack by the threshold, and exited the same way it had come in. Watson didn't pursue it. He knelt by the bed and spent the rest of the night there, cross in hand and the Bible open on the floor in front of him, not reading, simply keeping the pages visible. At dawn, he examined Edwin's neck. On the right side of the neck, near the jugular vein, I found 2 punctures, the distance between the centers of which was approximately 1 inch and 3/8. The diameter of each puncture was no more than 1/4 of an inch. The edges were clean, without torn tissue. The bleeding had stopped, but traces of dried blood ran down the back of his neck to his collarbone. I'd seen similar marks before. I saw them on Mary Olive Brown's neck the day she died, when I was preparing her body for burial, and I'd chalked them up to insect bites. Edwin opened his eyes as Watson removed his hand from his neck. The young man wasn't surprised by the priest's presence. He didn't ask the time. He simply looked at the door and asked that she not be allowed in again. The cross worked. This was the first documented fact, and Watson recorded it without triumph, with the methodical precision of a man who understands that a single fact does not necessarily constitute a system. He spent the morning of January 19th at Edwin's bedside, never leaving the room for more than a few minutes. The young man was conscious, but so weak he couldn't hold a glass of water. His pulse, which Watson checked hourly, was at 48 beats per minute, which for a 24-year-old man meant critical cardiac failure. The skin on the backs of his hands became almost transparent, so that the bluish tendon branches were visible through it. Family physician Stevens, summoned by the family's father, George Brown, early in the morning, examined the wounds on the neck and wrote in his journal that he could not explain their origin by any known pathological mechanism. Watson noted in his diary that Stevens stared at the wounds for a long time and remained silent. Then he closed the journal and told George Brown that the boy wouldn't survive the next week unless his diet improved. Watson wrote this down without comment, but the next page of the diary begins with a short phrase which he underlined twice. It's not about diet. It was on that day, January 19th, that Edwin began talking about his sister. It happened in the afternoon, when his father had gone out into the yard and Watson was alone at his bedside. The young man lay with his eyes closed, and the priest already thought he was asleep when Edwin began speaking quietly and evenly, without preamble. He reported that Mercy had been coming every night for several weeks. He said he initially thought it was a dream because she only appeared when he was passing out from a fever. But then he began to sense her presence even before he fell asleep, in the smell of damp earth and the cold that came before her. Watson recorded his words as accurately as possible, with the caveat that he was conveying them indirectly, as he considered direct reproduction of someone else's speech an imprecise instrument. According to his recording, the young man explained the following. His sister didn't just come, she spoke to him. She called him to follow her, describing it as a departure to a place where there is no pain and no illness. She said she had already prepared a space for him where she was. She said their mother and older sister were already there waiting for him. Watson asked if Edwin wanted to follow her. The young man was silent for a long time. Then he said that at night, when she was near, he wanted to get up and walk. That the desire was physical, like hunger or thirst, and that it was stronger than fear. But now, in the daylight, he understands. The place where she calls him is not the place she describes. He said that once, when she was very close, he felt a chill emanating from her and realized it wasn't the chill of death, but of something that exists after death and has nothing to do with peace. Watson wrote down the last part of his words verbatim, italicizing, "She's dead, Father Watson. But she hasn't left. She's here, and she's hungry. Don't let her in. She'll come again as soon as it gets dark, and next time I might not be able to resist." The priest closed the diary and sat up straight. He made this decision, he said, not in minutes, but in seconds, because all the necessary facts were already before him and required only one conclusion. Watson came from a family of Methodist pastors, was educated in Providence, and was a man of book culture and clear-headedness. His diary doesn't contain a single page describing his personal mystical experiences up to this point. He wasn't prone to exaltation. And that's precisely why his next entry weighs as much as it does. He wrote the following. What entered this room at night was neither a hallucination nor the product of the morbid imagination of a dying youth, nor an atmospheric phenomenon, nor a manifestation of grief. This creature has physical characteristics, reflexes, and an anatomy tailored to a specific function. It feeds on the blood of the living. It uses the image of the dead as a tool of deception. It operates at night and retreats before consecrated silver. It had already killed 3 members of one family and was now killing a 4th. Watson knew what it was. Not one of those folk superstitions that he, as an educated man, was accustomed to reject. From a source that is not usually quoted aloud in polite society, but which is kept in the library of every old diocese. A 16th-century treatise on the nature of the undead, compiled by Dominican monks after a series of incidents in Transylvania. He'd read it back in seminary like a curious historical document. Now he recalled every page with the precision that comes only when you're reading about something happening right in front of you. The creature described in the treatise was called Nosferatu. Not a metaphor, not a symbol. A biological species that parasitizes the living, using the dead body as a shell and continuing to exist after the physical death of the host by consuming blood. The treatise listed 4 documented methods of neutralization. Watson remembered them all. The first method required daylight. The second required an aspen stake and a hammer. The third required holy water. The fourth, the most radical and most reliable, required fire. Watson went out into the yard where George Brown was chopping wood and told him they needed to talk. According to the diary entry, the conversation lasted about 20 minutes. The father was a farmer, a man of little education, but not without practical acumen. He listened silently. When Watson finished, Brown stuck his axe into the block and asked only one question. How many men would be needed? Watson replied, enough to hold the coffin, if it turned out to be something. That same night, the priest dispatched 3 farmhands from Brown's farm to neighboring farms with verbal messages for specific people: the headman, the eldest sons, and 2 former constables. The content of the message was simple. Tomorrow at midnight, Baptist Church Cemetery. Bring shovels and lanterns. No questions until arrival. By dawn on January 20th, 7 people had confirmed their presence. Watson returned to Edwin's bedside and sat there until morning, holding the cross outstretched toward the door. There was no fog that night, but Watson could smell the damp earth and rotting flowers distinctly from midnight until dawn, as if a creature stood outside the door and waited, knowing the way was closed. It knew there was a cross beyond the door, and it knew the cross was not eternal. Edwin didn't sleep the entire night from January 19th to 20th. Watson recorded this separately because sleep deprivation in a person in his condition was, in itself, a medical anomaly. The young man lay motionless, his eyes open and staring at the ceiling, breathing in the same 8-second pauses the priest had counted the night before. But he wasn't unconscious. He wasn't delirious. He simply lay there, listening to something Watson couldn't hear. Around 3 o'clock in the morning, Edwin turned his head toward the door. Watson tensed and raised his cross. The young man quietly said that she was outside. He said he could hear her breathing through the door, even though doors of that wood and that thickness were impervious to sound. Watson stood up and placed his palm against the wooden surface of the door. It was cold. Not cool, like wood in an unheated hallway on a winter night. So cold that he pulled his hand away after 3 seconds because his fingers hurt, as if he'd touched metal in the cold. He didn't open the door. He returned to the bed and placed the cross on top of the blanket at Edwin's neck. The temperature in the hallway, as he'd checked it that morning, was normal. No traces, no fog. Only the smell, which by dawn had dissipated so much that Watson wasn't sure he'd imagined it. But Edwin, when he opened his eyes in the morning and saw the priest still there, said only one thing. He said that his dead sister was calling him into the darkness, and that her voice was different now, not like it had been in life. Deeper, as if she wasn't the only one speaking. Watson wrote this down and underlined it. On January 20th, he spent the day preparing, acting methodically and without the haste that breeds mistakes. The first thing he did was visit the church and take from the sacristy everything he needed: a flask of holy water, blessed on Epiphany and sealed with wax, a spare silver crucifix, a prayer book with prayers for the dead and for the expulsion of evil spirits. He packed it all into a leather bag and carried it with him all day, never letting go. Then he wrote a letter to the Diocese of Providence. Watson had no illusions about the response he would receive and sent the letter not to seek permission, but to create a paper trail. In the letter, he outlined the facts: the symptoms of the Brown family's illness, the nature of the wounds on Edwin's neck, the nocturnal apparition in the sick room, the creature's reaction to the consecrated silver. He did not use the word vampire. He wrote, "A creature possessing the characteristics of the undead described in 16th century Dominican treatises." The letter was sent by daylight mail. Judging by archival data, no reply was ever received, which in itself is a documented fact. That afternoon, Watson rode horseback to 3 of the 7 farmers who had confirmed their presence and had a brief, private conversation with each. He explained exactly what they would see in the coffin and what they might have to do. He didn't mince his words. 2 of the 3 remained silent for a long time after this conversation. One of them, a certain Caleb Pratt, a former constable, replied that he had seen enough in his life not to be surprised by anything that should not have an answer. The third, a farmer, whose name Watson encrypted in his diary with the initials T.G., asked if what he was planning was blasphemous. Watson answered him as one might answer who had already made up his mind and didn't need his approval. He said it was blasphemous to allow a creature that used the body of a Christian girl as a murderous instrument to continue doing its work while the living died one by one. T.G. didn't answer, but at midnight he came to the cemetery with a shovel. The exhumation was scheduled for midnight on January 21st for several reasons, which Watson listed in his diary with the same business-like efficiency with which a farmer lists his reasons for choosing a particular day for sowing. The first reason: daylight, according to the treatise, immobilizes undead in a state of rest, but does not destroy them or render them unconscious. Working in daylight means working with a creature that sees and hears everything, but cannot act. This offered the advantage of speed, but not safety. The second, more practical reason: county authorities would not approve an exhumation under any circumstances, and it was impossible to conceal the presence of 8 men with shovels in the cemetery in broad daylight. Watson returned to Edwin on the evening of January 20th and spent several hours at his bedside. By that time, the young man couldn't lift his head from the pillow. Watson estimated that his weight had dropped by about 12 pounds in the previous week. The veins on his forearms had darkened and bulged, creating an appearance the priest described succinctly and accurately: a living skeleton with blue rivers beneath parchment-like skin. Edwin asked him to stay the night. Watson said he'd leave late and return before dawn. He didn't say where. Before leaving, he performed one action, which he recorded in his diary as a preventative measure. He took the blessed chalk and drew a line along the bottom edge of the door from the inside, then along the sill of the only window. Then he hung a small silver crucifix on a cord from the outside of the doorknob, pressing it against the wood so it touched the surface of the door. Edwin watched silently. The young man asked if it would help. I replied that it would help until dawn. He asked what would happen at dawn. I replied that by dawn there would be no reason to fear. He looked at me for a long time. Then he closed his eyes. I don't know if he believed me. I myself wasn't sure I was telling the truth. At midnight, 8 people gathered at the gates of the Exeter Baptist Church Cemetery. The temperature dropped to 14 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. The ground was frozen to a depth of about 2 feet. Everyone had a lantern and a shovel. Watson carried a leather bag containing a flask of holy water and a prayer book. Mercy Brown's grave was in the far corner of the cemetery, near the north wall. The headstone was simple, unadorned, with a name and dates. The ground above the grave was untouched, level, covered with a crust of ice that crunched underfoot. Watson shone a flashlight over the headstone and looked at the burial date. 3 days had passed. He gave the command to dig. The shovels penetrated the frozen top layer with difficulty, with a crunch that seemed audible for miles around in the still night. The farmers worked in silence. No one spoke. Watson stood to the side with a flashlight and kept an eye on the perimeter, turning his head every few seconds to check the darkness between the tombstones. The darkness was still, but the smell, that same smell of damp earth and rotting flowers, was so distinct that 2 farmers working near the center of the pit began breathing through their mouths. 40 minutes later, Caleb Pratt's shovel struck the coffin lid. Watson descended into the pit first. He examined the lid by the light of a lantern held up by one of the farmers. The lid was intact. The hinges hadn't been tampered with from the inside. The lock hadn't been broken. He unzipped the bag, pulled out a flask of holy water, and handed it to Pratt, telling him to keep it ready. Then he picked up the cross and nodded to the 2 farmers with the crowbars. The lid gave way with a brief crack of dry wood. Watson lifted the lantern and peered inside. Mercy Brown lay in the coffin as if she had fallen asleep a moment ago. Watson passed the flashlight over the coffin from left to right, slowly, like a man who inspects every inch and doesn't allow himself to rush, because haste at such moments kills more quickly than any threat. The body had not decomposed. This was the central fact, and Watson recorded it with the same methodicalness with which a forensic surgeon records the condition of a corpse at the scene of a crime. Mercy Brown lay in the frozen ground for 3 days at a temperature designed to preserve her body in a state characteristic of primary rigor mortis. Her skin should have been gray, waxy, with the beginnings of marbling. Her facial features should have become sharper. Instead, Watson saw this. The skin retained a hue he could only describe as vibrant, not pink or warm, but certainly not gray or waxy. The features were relaxed, as those of a sleeping person would be, not those of a dead person in a state of rigor mortis. The hair lay naturally without the stiffness caused by the cold. The arms were folded across the chest, as they had been during burial, but the fingers lacked the bluish tint that inevitably accompanies the cessation of blood circulation. One of the farmers standing over the pit said aloud what everyone had seen. He said she looked alive. Watson didn't answer. He lowered the flashlight and examined her lips. They were red, wet. On her lower lip, near the right corner of her mouth, was a dark streak of dried blood, the same streak he'd seen that night in Edwin's room. Watson straightened up and looked at George Brown, who stood over the pit with a lantern in his lowered hand. The father of the family looked at his daughter's body and remained silent. His face was unreadable. Watson later wrote that it was the face of a man who already knew what he was seeing, and for whom confirmation brought no relief, because confirmation meant only worse. Caleb Pratt asked in a low voice what to do now. Watson opened his prayer book to the page he'd marked earlier in the day and began reading the prayer for the repose of his soul. He read quietly, evenly, without pausing. The farmers at the pit removed their hats. George Brown continued to look at his daughter. In the silence of the night, the only sounds were Watson's reading, the creaking of frozen branches somewhere beyond the north wall, and the breathing of 8 people turning to steam with each exhalation. Watson finished the prayer and closed the prayer book. Then he handed the lantern to Pratt and climbed back into the pit to examine the body closely. It was a necessary procedure which he performed systematically without rushing. He checked his wrists. There was no pulse, which in itself was neither proof nor disproof of anything. He checked his skin temperature with the back of his hand. His body was cold, but not as cold as one would expect after 3 days in the frozen ground. The difference was slight, but it was there. He checked her eyes, lifting her eyelids. The cornea was clear, without the cloudiness typical of corpses even 24 hours after death. Then he looked at her chest. Mercy Brown's ribcage moved up and down, barely perceptibly. Watson wrote that he wasn't sure that was what he was seeing, and that for the first 2 seconds he attributed it to the play of shadows cast by the lantern. Then the movement repeated itself. Slow, with a long pause, but perfectly distinct. Not a spasm, not the post-mortem release of gases that creates the illusion of soft tissue movement. Rhythmic, controlled breathing. He stepped back and hit his back against the pit wall. Silence fell over the pit. The farmers saw his face before he could say anything. Pratt lowered the lantern into the hole and peered in for himself. He stared silently for a few seconds. Then he uttered a single word, which Watson reproduced in his diary without clarification, adding that he considered it the only accurate word under the circumstances. At that moment, the moon disappeared behind the clouds. Watson recorded this as a fact, without interpretation. A cloud front had been moving from the northwest all evening, and the disappearance of the moonlight was a predictable meteorological event. But he also recorded that precisely at the moment when the moonlight faded and only 4 lanterns remained to illuminate the grave, the body in the coffin shifted position. Not abruptly, not convulsively. Slowly, like someone waking from a peaceful dream. Mercy Brown's head turned to the right. The arms folded across the chest, spread out to the sides, and lay along the body. The fingers spread out. Watson, standing in the pit 2 feet from the coffin, saw it all by the light of Pratt's lantern, which he held above his head, and described the movements with the precision that only absolute terror, turning the brain into a recording instrument, can provide. Then Mercy Brown opened her eyes. Watson only managed to see one thing. The eyes were black. The same absolutely black, irisless ones he'd seen in Edwin's room. This meant that what was looking at him from the coffin was the same creature he'd already encountered. Not a new phenomenon, not a misperception. The same one. The creature looked at him without surprise, without the initial reaction that any living creature suddenly awakens to unfamiliar surroundings displays. It looked as if someone had known they were coming looking for them and was waiting for that moment. Then it smiled. Watson described this smile in one sentence, and it's the shortest sentence in the entire diary. He wrote, "It was the smile of a creature that knows you're too late." One of the farmers dropped a lantern over the pit. The dropped lantern landed on the edge of the pit and didn't go out. It just rolled to the side, and its light fell at an angle, so that the shadows from the gravestones stretched out into unnaturally long stripes across the frozen ground. Watson captured this moment because it was the shift in lighting that gave him the split second that saved the life of at least one person. In the changed light, he saw that the creature in the coffin was no longer lying down. It was sitting up. The movement from a horizontal to a vertical position took less time than it takes a person to sit up from a lying position. No muscle tension, no use of the arms for support. The body had simply shifted position, as an object subject to physical laws different from those that govern living flesh shifts position. Watson stood in the pit 1.5 feet from the coffin, and there was no obstacle between him and the creature. He raised the cross. The creature looked at the crucifix and stopped. It didn't jump back, didn't make a sound. It simply stood where it was, as if it had hit an invisible wall. Watson described it as the reaction of an animal confronted with the scent of a higher-order predator. Complete stillness, intense attention, a counting of its options. The creature looked at the cross, then looked at Watson, then back at the cross. There was no fear in its black eyes. There was calculation. 7 figures stood over the pit, and Watson heard one of them begin to back away. Their steps were uneven, crunching on the ice, clearly uncontrolled. He couldn't turn to see who it was. He couldn't lower the cross. He couldn't move without closing the space between himself and the creature. The creature solved the problem differently. It didn't go through Watson. It rose from the coffin to its full height in a single vertical movement without any intermediate steps, and leaped. Not into the pit, not onto the priest. Up. Watson described the leap as physiologically improbable. A creature about 5 feet 4 inches tall had covered the vertical distance from the bottom of the pit to ground level, about 7 feet, without a running start, without any visible muscular effort, with the ease with which a cat leaps onto a windowsill. It landed on the edge of a pit between 2 farmers who hadn't retreated far enough. Watson scrambled up, clutching the cross in his right hand, using his left hand and his legs. He reached ground level a few seconds later and saw the following. The 2 farmers between whom the creature had landed stood motionless, not in the stupor of fear, but in that peculiar stillness that Watson later described as a lack of willpower. They stood upright, their arms hanging at their sides, their eyes staring blankly ahead like soldiers on a parade ground. Their shovels lay at their feet. The creature stood between them, not touching them with its hands. It simply looked at them one by one, shifting its gaze from one to the other, and that was enough. Watson understood what it was before he could even formulate it into words. The treatise described this ability in detail. This type of undead possesses a direct neural effect through visual contact, paralyzing voluntary motor skills in people with weakened mental resistance. Weakened by fear, by surprise, by any state in which critical thinking gives way to reflexive thinking. Both farmers watched the creature as it leaped. That was enough. The creature wasted no time. It turned to the first of those hypnotized, a small red-haired man named Seamus Connor, a farmhand from a nearby farm, and did something to his right hand. Watson didn't have time to see the precise movement, only the result. Connor slowly raised his hand, holding a rope-cutting knife. The knife was small, with a blade about 4 inches long, but sharpened. Connor lifted it with the mechanical precision that only comes from someone following instructions, not making a decision. Watson screamed and rushed forward with the cross. The creature turned toward him, and at that moment the second hypnotized farmer, Thomas Gibbs, the same one who had asked about blasphemy during the preparatory interview, raised his shovel with both hands. Caleb Pratt reacted before Watson. He was a former constable and apparently retained the ability to act in situations where the brain had already stopped and only instincts were operating. He grabbed Connor's wrist with both hands and twisted it back, preventing him from completing the movement. The knife fell to the frozen ground. Connor didn't resist, but he didn't let go of his grip on his own. His fingers only loosened when Pratt slammed his wrist hard against his own knee. Thomas Gibbs lowered the shovel, not because he was stopped, because Watson had found himself between him and the creature with the raised cross, and the creature had once again reacted to the crucifixion with the same forced halt it had in the pit. Watson stood 5 feet away, holding the cross at arm's length, and between them now there was only distance and silver. The hypnotized farmers began to come to their senses simultaneously, within seconds of the creature's gaze leaving theirs. Connor sank to his knees right where he'd been standing. Thomas Gibbs dropped his shovel and clutched his head with both hands. Both were alive. Both were conscious. Neither understood what had just happened to their bodies. The creature looked at Watson. He looked back. Nothing happened between them for about 10 seconds, during which they both assessed the situation. Watson took a step forward with the cross, then another. The creature took a step back, then another. Its feet moved silently across the frozen ground, producing neither a crunch nor a creaking sound, as if it had no weight. It backed away toward the north wall of the cemetery, its black eyes never leaving the crucifix. Watson continued to move forward. He did not say a prayer out loud. He held the cross straight and walked as the creature backed away. Behind him, Pratt picked up one of the lanterns and followed. The other farmers stood still. The creature's back hit the stone wall of a crypt at the northern edge of the cemetery and stopped. Watson was 4 feet away. In the light of Pratt's flashlight, he could see his face clearly. The skin on his cheekbones was taut, showing no signs of decay, but with a barely noticeable network of dark veins beneath the surface, running from his temples down to his jaw. His nostrils were flared. He was breathing through his nose, rapid and shallow like a cornered predator. Watson pulled out a flask of holy water. I unscrewed the lid with my right thumb, keeping my left hand, which held the cross, in my hand. The water in the flask, blessed on Epiphany, was cold even through the metal of the vessel. I splashed it on the creature, aiming for its face. The effect was immediate and physical. Water splashed onto my cheek, chin, and exposed neck. The skin immediately darkened at the points of contact, like paper darkening under an open flame before igniting. Smoke rose from these places, thin and whitish, with the smell of scorched hair and something more ancient, something for which Watson had no analogy. The wounds did not bleed. A dark liquid, almost black, oozed from them, thick and leaving shiny streaks on the skin. The creature made a sound. It wasn't a scream or a hiss. Watson wrote that it was a sound that shouldn't be produced by anything with a throat, lungs, and vocal cords. A sound that contained a component physically impossible for a single source. The creature turned around. The crypt door behind him was locked with a metal bolt, but that didn't matter. It passed through the crack between the door and the frame, just as it had passed through the crack under Edwin's door a few nights ago. Without forcing it, without opening it. Simply by ceasing to be a solid body where a solid body would not fit, the bolt on the other side slid shut on its own. Watson stood before the closed door of the crypt, an empty flask in one hand and a cross in the other. Pratt raised his lantern and shone it on the door. The metal of the bolt was intact. The hinges were undamaged. There was no sound from within. Watson placed his hand on the crypt door. The wood was cold. He removed his hand, opened the diary right there in the cemetery by the light of a lantern, and wrote down the time. It was 20 minutes past 1 in the morning, January 21st, 1892. Then he wrote down the following. The creature is cornered. 4 hours and 40 minutes until dawn. That's plenty of time. 4 hours and 40 minutes until dawn. Watson took 3 steps away from the crypt door and turned to face the farmers. He counted 5 standing and 1, Seamus Connor, still kneeling on the frozen ground. Thomas Gibbs stood upright but held both hands in front of him, looking at them like a man who doesn't recognize his own limbs. Caleb Pratt held the lantern and looked at the crypt door with an expression Watson described as a professional assessment. The former constable was weighing the thickness of the wood, the strength of the bolt, and the likelihood that whatever was behind the door would remain behind the door until morning. George Brown hadn't moved from his spot beside his daughter's unearthed grave since the creature had leaped from the hole. Watson reached him first. The father stood with a lantern at his side, staring into the open coffin where, minutes earlier, lay what he had buried 3 days earlier. The coffin was empty. There were marks left on the white lining fabric, which Watson examined by the light of his lantern and recorded in his diary with the precision of a man who works with his hands rather than think with his head. On the lining of the coffin, in the area of the head and shoulders, there are dark spots of organic origin, presumably traces of the same black liquid that emerged from the burns on the creature's skin upon contact with holy water. The smell in the coffin. Damp earth, rotting organic matter, and something sweet, concentrated, reminiscent of the smell of overripe fruit in the fermentation stage. The temperature inside the coffin is subjectively higher than the ambient air temperature by approximately 10 degrees Fahrenheit. Watson closed the coffin lid and ordered 2 farmers to fill the hole back in. Not because it had any ritual significance. Because an open hole in the middle of the cemetery would attract attention by morning, and the authorities' attention was the last thing needed now. The farmers picked up their shovels and began working silently. Frozen clods of earth fell onto the coffin lid with dull thuds that echoed throughout the cemetery with an unexpectedly loud thud. Connor rose from his knees on his own, undisturbed. He was so pale that in the flashlight's light he seemed almost gray. Watson examined his wrist, which Pratt had twisted backwards. The joint was intact, but already beginning to swell. Connor said he didn't remember picking up the knife. He said the last thing he clearly remembered was the moment the creature landed between him and Gibbs and looked him in the eye. After that, his memory was a kind of fog, in which he heard his own thoughts but couldn't control them. Watson listened, nodded, and wrote them down. Then he asked Connor if he could stand steady enough to hold the lantern. Connor said he could. Thomas Gibbs never explained what happened to him in those seconds while he held the shovel over his head. According to Watson's recording, the farmer hadn't uttered a word since regaining consciousness, and responded to all questions with only a brief shake of his head. Watson didn't press the issue. He later wrote that Gibbs's expression made it clear he remembered everything that had happened while the creature had him under its control, and that silence spoke volumes. The hole was filled in 20 minutes. The farmers packed the earth with shovels and retreated. Mercy Brown's headstone stood in its original location. The cemetery looked much as it had before the work began, save for the faint scent of disturbed frozen earth which would dissipate by morning. Watson gathered everyone at the cemetery's south gate, away from the crypt, and briefly outlined the situation. He reported that the creature was locked in the crypt and couldn't emerge until dawn, as this type of undead couldn't stand direct sunlight. He said that at dawn, they would enter the crypt and complete what they had come here to do. He explained what would be needed: an aspen stake at least 18 inches long, sharpened at one end, and a blacksmith's hammer heavy enough to drive the stake into the sternum with a single blow. He said this without preamble or pause, so as not to leave room for discussion. Pratt asked if anyone present had a suitable stake. Watson replied that he hadn't bothered with it beforehand, as he hadn't expected the creature to be driven into the crypt that very night. Pratt was silent for a few seconds, then glanced around and pointed to the cemetery fence, where several aspen fence posts had been erected several years earlier to replace rotted ones. Watson recorded that at that moment he felt a kind of professional respect for the former constable. One of the farmers chopped a stake with an axe in a few minutes, whittled the end to a sharp point, and handed it to Pratt. The stake was about 22 inches long and just over an inch in diameter at the base. Pratt weighed it in his hand, examined the tip, and declared it suitable. George Brown had the blacksmith's hammer, which he had brought with him on a cart along with the rest of his tools. Brown silently handed it to Pratt without asking why or who would hold it. Watson stationed the farmers in pairs at the two exits of the cemetery, instructing them to leave immediately if anything other than themselves or George Brown emerged from the crypt. He explained that they were to run without looking back or stopping for any reason. He specifically warned against looking the creature in the eye if it appeared outside. At these words, Connor nodded briefly, like a man who didn't need explanations twice. Watson spent the remaining 4 hours before dawn by the wall of the cemetery church, sitting on the stone steps with his journal in his lap. He wrote by the light of a lantern, holding it between his knees. He recorded everything that had happened during the night while the details were fresh, because he knew that what he had seen must not be lost, and what he was about to do at dawn might be his last chance to record it. George Brown sat nearby. He neither wrote nor spoke. He held the hat he'd taken off at his daughter's grave and never put back on, despite the frost. Watson glanced at him once and turned away. He wrote in his diary that he had no words for this man, and that any words now would be an insult. At 4:40 in the morning, the sky in the east began to brighten. Watson closed the diary, stood, and looked at the crypt door. It was closed. The bolt didn't budge. No sounds came from beyond the door, but the smell, that very smell of damp earth and rotting flowers, hung around the crypt like a dense, motionless wall, physically palpable, like the smell around a slaughterhouse or an open cellar where something has rotted for a long time without air. Watson picked up the leather satchel and checked that it contained a second bottle of holy water and a prayer book. Pratt took the stake and hammer. George Brown stood and buttoned his coat. The three of them approached the crypt door. Watson placed his hand on the bolt. The metal was so cold it clung to his skin through his glove. He slid the bolt back and pulled the door toward him. A scent of darkness and that sweet, putrid odor wafted from within, so concentrated that Pratt took an involuntary step back. Watson lifted his lantern and shone it inside. In the far corner of the crypt, on the stone floor, lay Mercy Brown, motionless. Watson didn't enter immediately. He stood in the doorway, holding his lantern up, looking in for at least 30 seconds before taking the first step across the threshold. It wasn't hesitation. It was a test. The crypt was small, about 12 by 8 feet, with a low vaulted ceiling of gray stone, covered in a thin layer of frost. Along the side walls stood 2 stone sarcophagi, which, judging by the dates carved on the lids, belonged to the family that founded this church back in the early 20th century. The floor was stone, with cracks between the slabs filled with dark moss, which in such frost should have been dry and dead, but in the light of the lantern it seemed damp. A single small window near the ceiling, no larger than a book, was covered with metal bars on the outside and something thickly draped on the inside. Watson took a closer look. The opening was filled with earth, fresh, dark, and clearly brought here deliberately, as there was no way for it to have come from the stone vault. The creature had already blocked out the only source of daylight. It lay face down in the far right corner at the base of the second sarcophagus. Its arms were extended alongside its body, palms up. Its hair spilled across the stone floor around its head. It was completely motionless, and this stillness was different from what Watson had seen in the coffin. There was the stillness of expectation. Here was the stillness of a forced state, similar to the appearance of an insect frozen in amber, the form preserved, but the will to move removed by an external force. Watson stepped over the threshold. The temperature inside the crypt was lower than outside, which in itself was an anomaly. A closed stone space, even in freezing temperatures, retains heat better than open air. He exhaled, and the steam from his breath hung in front of his face like a thick cloud, which lingered for several seconds longer than it should have. Pratt followed, holding a stake in his right hand and a hammer in his left. George Brown entered last and stood by the door, leaving it open. Watson crossed the crypt and stopped 2 steps from the creature. By the light of his lantern, he performed a quick visual inspection, the results of which he recorded in his journal with surgical precision. The holy water burns on his cheek, chin, and neck had darkened and dried over the past hours. The edges of the wounds had a jagged, uneven contour, as seen with second-degree chemical burns. The wounds themselves no longer oozed. They were caked with a dark crust, almost black in the center and fading to a dirty brown color toward the edges. The skin around the burns was taut, as skin taut with swelling, but there was no visible swelling. The wounds smelled sour, with a metallic taste in the air that Watson tasted on his tongue. He opened the breviary. He had kept the page marked since the evening before, when he had packed his bag in the sacristy. The prayer for the expulsion of an unclean spirit from the body of the deceased was composed in the 16th century and was never officially included in the standard service of the Episcopal Church. Watson had copied it out by hand from a tractate back in seminary, kept the note in his personal prayer book, and never imagined he'd have to read it over anything real. He began reading it quietly, evenly, without pausing, holding the page in his left hand and the lantern in his right. In the 3rd stanza, the creature stirred. Not suddenly, not with a jerk. The fingers of its right hand, palm up on the stone floor, slowly curled and clenched into a fist. Watson didn't interrupt his reading. Pratt stepped forward and stood to the side of the creature, holding the stake with both hands, point down, over the left side of the back, where the heart was located, under the shoulder blade. He held the stake vertically, and Watson saw out of the corner of his eye how Pratt's arms tensed. Watson continued reading. In the 7th stanza, the creature raised its head, slowly with the same mechanical precision that distinguished all its movements from human ones. It raised its head and turned it to the left, toward Watson, without raising its body. Its black eyes were open. They looked at the priest without a preconceived notion, without that moment of confusion that comes to any being awakening to an unfamiliar situation. They knew where they were. They knew who was standing next to them. And they knew what Watson was reading. His lips began to move. Watson recorded this separately because it was unexpected and important. The creature's lips moved silently, forming words he couldn't hear but could partially decipher from the articulation. He wrote that he couldn't discern the language. It wasn't English articulation, nor was it Latin. It was something with a different rhythm, a different distribution of vowels and consonants, with movements of the lips and tongue that didn't correspond to any language he knew. He wrote that it sounded, if spoken aloud, like a prayer. Only it was facing the wrong way. Pratt looked at Watson. Watson didn't stop reading. He only nodded. Pratt raised his hammer. At that moment, the creature stopped moving its lips. It looked at Pratt. Not at the stake, not at the hammer, at Pratt's face, straight into his eyes. Watson saw this out of the corner of his eye, and at the same moment, without stopping his reading, he stepped forward and blocked Pratt's view, standing between him and the creature so that the former constable could not see his eyes. Behind him, he heard Pratt exhale sharply and shortly, like a man who's just been plucked from the water. The creature was now looking at Watson. Watson was staring at the breviary, reading aloud without looking up from the page. He did this on purpose, and recorded this intention in his diary as a separate line. Look at the text, not at the face. In his peripheral vision, he saw the creature continue to stare at him, and he felt this stare physically, the way one feels a heat source directed at one's back or the air pressure before a blow. But until he looked up from the page, there was no contact. He finished the prayer and closed the prayer book. Then he looked at George Brown, standing by the door. The father of the family wasn't holding a lantern or a tool. He was holding a hat, the very one he hadn't worn since last night. He was looking at his daughter. Watson wrote that at that moment he had no words for the man, and that he didn't bother searching. He simply met his gaze and nodded. Brown nodded back. He walked over and stood on the other side of the creature, opposite Pratt, and took the hammer from its hands. Pratt handed over the hammer without a word and gripped the stake with both hands, changing to a shorter, more controlled grip, with the tip resting just above the creature's left shoulder blade. Watson opened the diary to a blank page and placed it on the sarcophagus lid next to him. He wrote down the time, 5:17 a.m. Then he closed the journal and put it in his bag. He removed the silver cross from around his neck and held it in his left hand, pointing it toward the creature's head as Pratt took up position. The creature lay motionless. Its black eyes were open, staring at the stone ceiling above. The chest moved in the same slow motions Watson had observed at the open coffin. Breathing, rhythmic, controlled, alive in the sense that something lives that is dead but not gone. Pratt looked at Watson. Watson uttered the first words of the prayer of absolution. Brown raised the hammer. The blow landed accurately. Watson registered it first because accuracy was all that mattered at that moment. Pratt struck without a backswing, short and vertical, with his body weight transferred to the stake at the moment of contact. The tip entered between the ribs on the left, under the shoulder blade, at an angle of approximately 45 degrees to the floor surface. George Brown's hammer struck the end of the stake in sync with Pratt's movement, and the sound they made together was short, hard, and final, like an axe cutting into damp wood. Then there was a screech. Watson spent more time describing it than any other sound in his diary, and still conceded that the words were fundamentally inaccurate. He wrote that it was not a cry of pain in the human sense because it lacked any component that could be associated with the pain response of a living being. It was a sound of a different nature. He described it as the sound air makes when it's forced out of a confined space, but with the difference that there was a tone to the sound, and the tone was fury, not agony. The rage of a creature that understands what's happening, and for whom it isn't causing suffering, but depriving it of something it considered rightfully its own. The screech lasted about 4 seconds. Watson counted them deliberately, keeping his gaze on the cross in his own hand, not on the creature. Then something began to flow from the wound that Pratt later described in one word, a word Watson reproduced in his diary without alteration. Resin, not blood. Watson recorded the difference in detail. Blood has a certain viscosity, a certain color ranging from scarlet to deep burgundy depending on oxygen saturation, a certain temperature, and a certain smell of iron and salt. What emerged from the wound around the stake met none of these parameters. The color was black, opaque, absorbing the lantern's light rather than reflecting it. Its viscosity was significantly higher than that of blood. The liquid moved slowly, stretching, leaving a trail on the stone floor that didn't spread but held its shape. The smell was the same one Watson already knew. Sweet, putrid, with a metallic note, but now concentrated to the point that Pratt turned his head to the side and swallowed. The temperature of the liquid was lower than the air temperature in the crypt, which Watson determined when a few drops landed on the back of his left hand. He didn't wipe them away immediately. He examined them by flashlight and recorded his observation. The drops didn't absorb into the skin or spread across it. They lay on the surface in individual spherical droplets, like mercury on glass. Watson shook them off with the back of his right hand and wiped his hand on the ground. The creature stopped moving about 10 seconds after the impact. Not immediately. At first, it thrashed. That's the word Watson used, and it's accurate. The body wasn't convulsing in the medical sense, wasn't twitching chaotically. It was thrashing purposefully, trying to shift position, trying to free itself with the same mechanical precision that characterized all its movements. Its hands moved across the stone floor, its fingers scraping against the flagstones. The legs bent at the knees and straightened several times. The head turned first left, then right. All this happened simultaneously and silently, after the screeching stopped, in a silence broken only by the scraping of fingers on stone and the breathing of 3 living people in a confined space. Pratt held the stake with both hands, keeping it steady. Brown held the hammer at the ready. Watson recited the prayer aloud, quietly and evenly, without pausing. He wrote that at that moment, reading wasn't a ritualistic act, but a practical one. While he was reading, his throat was occupied, and he couldn't accidentally utter anything else. This helped him avoid thinking about what was happening 2 feet away. After 10 seconds, the movements stopped. The body became motionless, completely, without the residual spasms that occur in humans or animals after death, when the nervous system continues to send signals to muscles that are no longer responding for a few seconds. It simply stopped, like a mechanical watch when its winding runs out. Pratt held the stake for a few more seconds, then removed his hands and straightened up. Brown lowered the hammer. Watson finished his prayer and closed the breviary. The crypt fell silent. Watson waited about a minute before proceeding to the next stage. He stood motionless and listened. No sounds from within the body, no movement. The fluid from the wound stopped flowing. The screeching didn't resume. The smell was still there, but its intensity began to diminish, slowly, like the smell of burning wood diminishes a few minutes after the fire is extinguished. Watson placed the lantern on the sarcophagus lid and opened the bag. The knife he used for the next step was his own, a household knife with a blade about 6 inches long. He had blessed it the night before, dipping it in the same flask of holy water he had used at the grave. The treatise described the next stage briefly and without detail, as if the compilers considered details unnecessary for someone who had reached this point. Watson didn't miss a single detail. He performed each action sequentially, methodically, with the precision required by a procedure in which there is no room for error. The extraction is complete. The organ turned out to be of normal anatomical size, about 4 inches long and 3 inches wide, but its color didn't correspond to any pathological condition known to me. It was black on the outside, with a surface resembling the surface of old skin, dried and tightened. When I made the incision for verification, which Pratt insisted on, the organ was solid inside, without the fluid-filled cavities that would normally be present in normal heart muscle. It was uniform in structure, dark throughout like a piece of anthracite. The odor from the cut was pungent, considerably more intense than the surrounding odor, and Brown emerged from the crypt a few seconds after that moment. Watson wrapped the removed organ in a canvas bag he had brought specifically for this purpose. He carried the bundle outside, where dawn had already turned the sky above the eastern horizon light gray, enough for him to discern the outlines of the gravestones without a flashlight. Pratt followed. Brown was already standing outside. The other farmers Watson had stationed around the perimeter moved closer, silently. Watson placed the bundle on a flat granite stone near the crypt wall, which was used to support wreaths during burials. Pratt brought a metal box from Brown's cart containing a few coals, still glowing under a layer of ash from the night before, and some dry kindling. The fire blazed within 2 minutes. Watson unrolled the canvas and placed the organ in the fire. It burned differently than organic matter, not with the smell of burnt meat, and not with that characteristic hissing sound that comes from moisture evaporating from living tissue when heated. It burned dryly, rapidly, and almost smokelessly, with a short, bluish flame that Pratt observed from a distance of 2 feet, and later, according to Watson's notes, described as a fire that looked cold. 3 minutes later, the box contained only a handful of gray ash, uniform, fine, without any discernible fragments. Watson poured the ashes into a small leather pouch. This, too, was prescribed by the treatise. This, too, had a purpose. He tied the pouch and put it in his bag next to the breviary. The eastern sky turned white. In a few minutes, the sun would break the horizon. Watson looked at the closed crypt door, then at George Brown. The father of the family stood by the granite stone, gazing at the cooling ashes in the metal box. Watson approached him and said they needed to go to Edwin, that the last stage needed to be completed before the young man woke up. Brown raised his head and looked at him. Then he looked at the crypt, then back at the priest. He quietly asked if it was finished. Watson replied that it was almost finished. They rode in silence. Brown was driving the horse. Watson sat next to him on the box with a leather bag on his lap. The cart was traveling along a dirt road between the cemetery and the farm, a distance of about 3/4 of a mile, and in the morning light, which now lay like an even white layer across the snow-covered fields, the road looked as if nothing had happened. Frozen ruts, black tree trunks lining the roadsides. Smoke from the farmhouse chimney in the distance, thin and straight in the still air. Watson held his bag in both hands and thought about the treatise, specifically about the part he'd read with the least attention in seminary, because it seemed to him then the most removed from reality. The treatise described the mechanism of the curse as follows. The Nosferatu doesn't kill the victim directly. He binds them to himself through blood, gradually over several visits, creating a dependency that works both ways. The victim weakens and fades not simply from blood loss, but because their life force flows into the creature and becomes part of its nature. The victim's death, however, is not the final point. It is a point of transition. A victim who died in a state of such attachment became undead themselves, since a part of them already belonged to the one who drank from them. This is why her mother and older sister died. This is why Mercy Brown rose from the coffin. And that's precisely why Edwin, who hadn't yet died but had been visited by the creature for weeks, was in a state from which conventional medicine couldn't relieve him. The attachment had been established. There was only one way to break it, and Watson carried that method in a leather pouch inside his bag. The treatise described the procedure briefly. The ashes of the burnt heart of the undead, taken internally by the victim, breaks the connection, as it destroys the substance that held this connection. Watson had read this in seminary with the academic skepticism of an 18th century man who'd stumbled into a 16th century library. Now he was carrying these ashes to the dying man's farm and felt not the slightest skepticism. Brown stopped the cart at the porch. They entered the house. The house was warm, quieter than outside, and smelled of pine wood and something cooked that one of the farmhands had set on the fire before dawn. Watson climbed up to Edwin's second floor, still wearing his coat. The door was closed. The hallowed chalk on the threshold was untouched. The silver crucifix hung on the doorknob where Watson had left it. He removed it, pocketed it, and knocked. No one answered. He opened the door. Edwin was asleep. Really asleep, not the heavy, forced oblivion Watson had observed on previous nights. His breathing was regular, with normal pauses between inhalation and exhalation, about 3 seconds, which, for a man in his condition, was a significant improvement. His pulse, which Watson immediately checked, was 56 beats per minute. 2 days earlier, it had been 48. A small difference, but it was in the right direction. Watson sat by the bed and waited. Brown followed him in and stood by the window, his back to the light. They waited for about 20 minutes until Edwin opened his eyes on his own. The young man saw his father first. Then he turned his gaze to Watson. He didn't ask the time. He didn't ask where they'd been. He only said that she hadn't come that night, that he'd lain and waited, but there was no smell and no cold, and at some point he'd simply fallen asleep. He said this with the surprise of a man for whom a good night was an event, not the norm. Watson pulled a leather pouch from his bag. He explained to Edwin what exactly it contained, briefly and without any details the young man didn't need. He said it was ashes, and that the ashes should be taken with water, and that this would complete what had been started the previous night. Edwin looked at the pouch. He didn't ask whose ashes they were. From his expression, Watson knew the boy knew, or guessed fairly accurately. Brown poured water from the jug into a mug and handed it to his son. Watson untied the bag and poured the ashes into the water. The ashes were gray, uniform, and fine, like the ash from burnt paper. It dissolved almost completely in the water, turning it a pale gray, leaving only a fine suspension on the surface. Watson stirred the contents of the mug with the handle of a spoon and handed it to Edwin. The young man took the mug in both hands. He held it for a few seconds without raising it to his mouth. Watson didn't rush him. Brown looked out the window. Outside, the sun had risen above the horizon and lay in low, slanting stripes across the snow in the yard. Edwin drank. He drank slowly, in small sips, like a man who has difficulty swallowing because of weak throat muscles. He drank it all, down to the bottom, and set the mug on the bedside table. Then he leaned back against the pillows and closed his eyes. Watson waited. He didn't know how long the procedure would take. The treatise didn't specify a time frame. He waited and looked at the young man. After a few minutes, Edwin opened his eyes and looked at the ceiling. Then he did something Watson hadn't expected, something he recorded in his diary with the meticulous care one uses to record clinically significant observations. The young man took a deep breath. Fully, without the carefulness of a man whose every breath causes pain. His chest rose to its fullest. He held his breath for a second. Then he exhaled slowly and evenly. It was the first full breath Watson had heard from him in all the days he'd been in this house. Brown heard it too. He turned from the window and looked at his son. Edwin looked at his father. Nothing passed between them. Watson stood up, picked up his bag, and left the room, closing the door behind him. He went down to the room below and sat down at the table. One of the farmhands brought him a mug of hot tea without asking. Watson held the mug in his hands and looked out the window at the snow-covered yard. The sun was rising. The snow was white and motionless. Everything seemed normal. He sat like that for about half an hour. Then he took out his journal and began writing. He wrote quickly until the details faded, until fatigue made his memory unreliable. He described everything: the crypt, the blow, the screech, the black liquid, the ash. He described Edwin's condition before and after the procedure. He wrote that by all observable signs, the ritual described in the 16th century treatise had worked, and that he had no reason to believe otherwise. He then wrote his final entry for the day. On January 21st, 1892, at 6:40 a.m., the threat posed by the entity identified as Nosferatu, using the body of Mercy Lev Brown as a shell, was eliminated. All 4 neutralization methods described in the treatise were applied in the prescribed sequence. Edwin Brown's condition shows the first signs of improvement. The case is closed. He closed the diary, finished the infusion, and rose from the table. He was getting ready to put on his coat and go to church to get a few hours' sleep on the sofa in the sacristy, which he used for that purpose during his nights on duty. He put on his coat. He buttoned it. Then he turned to the mirror by the door to straighten his collar. The mirror reflected the room, the table, the window, the kitchen door, a coat on a hook on the wall. Watson stood directly in front of the mirror, 15 inches from its surface. There was no one in the mirror. Watson stood there for about a minute. He deliberately recorded the time, counting the seconds, because precision was the only tool he had left at that moment. He moved his hand in front of the mirror's surface. There was no reflection. He brought the flashlight closer, even though the room was already lit by morning light. Nothing had changed. The mirror reflected everything in the room with the precision and clarity of perfect glass. Everything, that is. He walked away from the mirror and sat down on the nearest chair. There's no immediate entry in the diary about this moment. The next entry is dated the same day, but about midday, and from the nature of the handwriting, which Watson himself later commented on as having changed noticeably from this page, it is clear that the writer's hand was not entirely steady. He described what happened methodically, without rhetoric, as he had described all previous events. But between the lines, in his choice of words and in what he deliberately omitted, one can read the following. A man who had acted as an expert all night was confronted with a fact for which an expert has no record. He reconstructed the chronology in reverse order, attempting to pinpoint the moment of infection. The treatise described the mechanism of transmission briefly, without detail, which the authors apparently considered self-evident to an audience dealing with similar cases firsthand. Nosferatu transmits its nature through blood. Not through a bite, as folklore holds, but through direct contact of its substance with exposed mucous membranes or broken skin of a living person. Blood, saliva, the black liquid Watson had observed flowing from the holy water burns and from the autopsy wound. Any of these routes would have been sufficient. Watson recalled the drops on the back of his left hand, the very ones that had fallen from the stake during the blow and which he had brushed on the ground instead of wiping away immediately. He examined the back of his left hand in the morning light. The skin was clean, without burns, without marks. This meant nothing. The treatise did not describe the external symptoms of infection in the early stages. He described only the end result. Then Watson recalled a second moment. In the crypt, as he stood between Pratt and the creature, blocking the former constable's view to prevent eye contact, he himself met the creature's gaze for a split second. He described it in his journal as follows. Unintentional contact, not full, no more than a second. He was looking at the prayer book. He deliberately kept his eyes downcast, but at the moment of turning, as he stepped between Pratt and the creature, there was an angle at which their gazes inevitably met. Watson recorded that at that moment he felt something like an electric shock to the back of his head, short and sharp, which he attributed to the sudden movement and fatigue. He no longer attributed it to fatigue. The treatise distinguished 2 types of effects through eye contact. The first, short-term, produced the hypnotic effect Watson observed in Connor and Gibbs, a loss of voluntary control for the duration of contact, followed by full recovery. The second, with longer or repeated contact, was described differently. The treatise used a Latin term, which Watson translated in his diary as mark. Not infection in the full sense. Rather, it refers to the beginning of a process that, without intervention, develops in the same way as bloodborne infection, only more slowly. Watson memorized all the signs the treatise listed for the early stage. There were 7 of them. He tested each one against himself, sitting at his desk with the diary open before him. First, no reflection in the mirror. Confirmed. Second, increased sensitivity to sunlight, manifested by physical discomfort in direct sunlight. Watson looked at the streak of morning sunlight falling through the window onto the floor next to his chair. He shifted his position so that the streak fell on his right hand. A few seconds later, he sat back down. He wrote down, a burning sensation, moderate, subsiding with distance from the source. Third, a change in olfactory perception, expressed as an increased sensitivity to the smell of blood. Watson examined his hands. On his left hand at the base of his thumb was a small abrasion from climbing out of the pit, something he hadn't thought about since it happened. He raised his hand to his face and smelled the scent so distinctly and so sharply that he pulled his hand away immediately. He wrote down the result and made a short mark next to the 3rd sign. The 4th, 5th, 6th, and 7th signs required time to manifest. Watson wrote them down in a column and left a blank space next to each. He closed the diary and sat motionless for several minutes. Then he opened it again and wrote what became the longest continuous entry in the document, spanning 3.5 pages. It wasn't a recounting of events or a list of observations. It was a plan. Watson approached his own infection with the same methodical approach he'd taken to eliminating the threat at the cemetery. He divided his plan into 3 parts. The first was documentation. Everything he knew had to be written down in full while his mind remained his own. The second part concerned isolation. He was not to be in the presence of other people at night, and especially not in the presence of Edwin Brown, whose weakened state made him vulnerable to any form of undead, even those in their early stages. The third part dealt with what the treatise called the reversibility of the process at an early stage. The treatise claimed that the mark obtained through brief visual contact could be eliminated within the first 3 days, provided certain conditions were met. The conditions were as follows: continuous contact with consecrated objects, daily communion, complete abstinence from sleep during the dark hours of the day, and the internal use of a composition, the recipe for which the treatise gave with the same business-like efficiency with which the pharmaceutical manuals of that time gave recipes for medicinal mixtures. The composition contained several components, most of which Watson could obtain from the church sacristy or the local apothecary during the day. He made a list of the ingredients and put it in his pocket. Then he stood, grabbed his bag and coat, and left the farmhouse without returning to Edwin. He left Brown a note on the kitchen table stating only that he would be back in the evening and that the young man was not to leave the room until he returned. He didn't explain the reason. It was daylight outside. The sun was low on the horizon, as it is in January in New England, and its light was white and cold. Watson walked to the cart Brown had left by the porch, harnessed the horse, and drove out toward Exeter. The road ran through an open field for about a quarter mile, and the sun shone directly on his face the entire time. He rode with his eyes closed, holding the reins by feel, navigating the ruts beneath the wheels. He only opened his eyes when the road entered the shade of the trees. He reached the church and entered through the side door of the sacristy. It was cool and dark inside, and in this semi-darkness, for the first time in 24 hours, Watson felt something akin to relief. He recorded this in his diary immediately, sitting right there on the steps by the altar, because relief upon entering the shadow was the 4th sign listed in the treatise. And now there was a mark next to it. 4 out of 7. Within 6 hours of discovering the first sign. Watson put the journal away, stood, and walked to the altar. He knelt, placed both hands on the cold stone, and began to pray. Not from a text, not from a prayer book. In his own words, quietly, In the empty church, in the morning light filtering through the stained glass windows and casting colorful patches on the stone floor, he prayed for a long time. He didn't write down what exactly, but the next page of his diary begins with words he underlined with a single, even line. I have 3 days. 3 days. Watson wrote this as a fact, not as a hope, and the difference between the two formulations was crucial for him. Hope presupposes uncertainty. Fact presupposes a plan. He had a plan, and he intended to spend the first 6 hours of that plan in the church, poring over the ingredients list and the breviary, while his mind remained lucid enough to work with the texts. He began by taking inventory of the sacristy. He already had the consecrated objects the treatise required him to keep with him at all times. A silver cross on a cord, which he wore under his collar the entire time, and a spare crucifix in his bag. The treatise specified that the objects must touch the skin, not simply be within reach. Watson removed the cross from its cord, found a thin leather strip in the sacristy, threaded the cross through it, and tied it around his left wrist so that the silver lay on the inside, above the vein. He tied it tightly enough to prevent it from slipping off during sleep, should sleep occur despite the treatise's instructions. He sewed a spare crucifix to the inside of his coat collar using a needle and thread from a sewing kit kept in a drawer in the sacristy. The job took about 20 minutes. His fingers were acting less well than usual, not because of the trembling, but because of that strange slowness of fine motor skills that he had noticed that morning, and which he had written down in his diary as a potential 5th symptom on the list. He divided the ingredients into 2 categories, those in the sacristy and those that required a trip to the apothecary. From the sacristy he took the chrism, the blessed salt, and a few drops of oil from the last unction, which remained in a small glass bottle in a locked cabinet. He kept the key to the cabinet himself, which simplified the task. From the apothecary he needed wormwood, juniper berries, and silver filings. The last ingredient was the most unusual, but the treatise was categorical on this point. Silver had to be present not only on the outside, but also on the inside. Watson left the church by a side door, keeping in the shadow of the building, and walked to Martin Cole's pharmacy on Exeter's main street, avoiding open, sunny stretches of road where they could be avoided. He recorded this route in his diary not to document his progress, but because avoiding the sunny areas was instinctive, not deliberate. He realized he was doing it only after he had already done it, and this observation was more important than the act of avoiding it. The 5th sign: an instinctive avoidance of direct sunlight without conscious decision. Apothecary Cole was an elderly man with a long-standing habit of not questioning a priest purchasing unusual ingredients. He dispensed the wormwood and juniper berries without comment. When asked for silver filings, he was silent for a few seconds, then said that he had a silver file and a piece of sheet silver, and that if the Reverend would wait a few minutes, he would make as much filings as needed. Watson waited at the counter, his back to the window overlooking the sunlit street. Cole worked silently with a file. Sawdust fell onto a sheet of white paper laid out on the workbench. Watson watched and thought about the treatise, specifically about the part of it that he still hadn't dared to reproduce in his diary in full, even though he knew it by heart. The treatise argued that reversibility of the process at an early stage is possible, but not guaranteed. He used the Latin word probable, probability. Not possible, not inevitable. Probable. Watson assessed this probability realistically and didn't waste any effort trying to assess it differently. Cole poured the sawdust into a small bag and handed it to Watson. He paid and left. He returned to the church and began preparing the mixture in the sacristy, using a copper bowl kept there for household purposes and an alcohol burner. The treatise did not specify exact proportions, only the order in which the components were added and the temperature regime. The mixture had to be heated, but not boiled. Watson worked methodically, adding the ingredients in the order given. First the wormwood, then the juniper berries, then the holy salt, then the myrrh, then the oil, Then the silver filings last, when the mixture had reached the right temperature. The smell was sharp, herbal, with a metallic note from the silver heated in the mixture. He removed the bowl from the burner and let the mixture cool. While he waited, he opened the journal and wrote down everything that had happened since his last entry. He wrote quickly, without editing, because editing requires going back to what he'd already written, and there was no time to do so now. When he finished writing and looked up from the page, he saw that the mixture in the copper bowl had cooled to room temperature. He drank it down in 3 gulps. The taste was bitter, with a metallic silver aftertaste and a sharp herbal note of wormwood that lingered on the tongue for several minutes. There was no immediate physical effect. The tract didn't promise any immediate effect. He promised to slow down the process if all conditions were met, including repeating the procedure daily for 3 days. Watson washed the bowl and put the remaining ingredients in his bag. Then he sat down at the table and opened the diary to a new page. He spent the rest of the day in the sacristy, emerging only twice, once for a parishioner's confession, which could not be cancelled without explanation, and once for the evening service. Both times he kept to the shadows at the back of the church where the direct light did not fall. None of the parishioners noticed anything or showed any sign of noticing. Watson conducted the service smoothly and without deviation from the usual order. After the service, he locked the church and returned to the sacristy. He placed all the consecrated objects he had on the table, arranging them around him as the treatise prescribed for the night vigil. He lit 3 candles. He opened the journal to the last completed page and reread everything he had written that day. Night fell around 5 o'clock in the evening, as it does in New England in January, quickly and without warning. Watson recorded the precise moment the last light of day disappeared from the narrow sacristy window. He wrote that with the onset of darkness, something changed in his perception of the surrounding space. Not abruptly, not frighteningly, quietly, like a person's perception changes when their eyes adjust to the darkness after bright light. Only in the opposite direction. The darkness became less dark. The outlines of objects became clearer than 3 candles had allowed. He saw a corner of the sacristy where the candlelight hadn't reached at all, and he saw it well enough to discern a crack in the plaster right at the floor. He wrote it down. The 6th sign. Then he put the diary aside and began reading the Psalter aloud, from the first page in the empty, dark sacristy, by 3 candles, holding a silver cross on his wrist and never taking his eyes off the text. Around midnight, he heard footsteps outside. They walked along the church wall, slowly, evenly, without haste. Watson paused mid-psalm and raised his head. Footsteps passed along the north wall, turned the corner, and continued along the west. Then they stopped at the side door of the sacristy, the very one through which he had entered and exited all day. There was no knock. Nothing in the lock turned. The doorknob didn't turn. Someone stood on the other side of the door, in the darkness, silent. Watson stared at the door and didn't move. He held a cross on his wrist and an open psalter in his lap. He didn't say a word. A few minutes later, the footsteps resumed. They walked back along the western wall, turned the corner, and fell silent, heading toward the cemetery. Watson looked down at the page of the Psalter and found the place where he had stopped. He finished the psalm and began the next one. But before continuing reading, he wrote one short sentence in his diary, placing it separately from the rest of the text, with a blank line before and after. It knows where I am. The second day began without sleep. Watson spent the night in the sacristy with an open psalter and 3 candles, which he changed as they burned down, rising each time and moving around the room to prevent the body from passing into that border state between wakefulness and sleep, which the treatise described as most dangerous. In this state, according to the text, the will weakened before consciousness had time to register its weakening, and it was at this moment that the mark was given the opportunity to develop unhindered. Watson took this as a medical fact, since everything else in the treatise turned out to be a medical fact, and he rose every time he felt his eyelids begin to feel heavy. He heard footsteps near the church wall twice more before dawn, once around 2 in the morning, once shortly before 5. Both times they stopped at the side door of the sacristy and left after a few minutes. Watson didn't open the door. He noted the time and continued reading. At dawn, he prepared a second mixture in a copper bowl. His hands were less efficient than the day before. Not because of the trembling, but because of the same sluggishness that he had noted yesterday. But now it had spread from his fingers to his wrists and partly to his forearms. The movements were precise but slow, as if there was a slight pause between the intention to move his hand and the actual movement, a pause that hadn't existed before. He recorded this as the progression of the 5th symptom and drank the mixture. The bitterness was more intense than the day before, or perhaps his sense of taste had changed. He couldn't decide for sure which of the two was correct, so he wrote down both options, placing a question mark between them. At 8 o'clock in the morning, he drove to Brown's farm. Edwin had already gotten out of bed by then. Not on his feet, not further than the edge of the bed, but on his own, unaided, which in itself was a significant change from the previous days. He was sitting on the edge of the bed when Watson entered the room, drinking broth from a mug. Watson's pulse, which he immediately checked, was 62 beats per minute, an increase of 6 beats in the last 24 hours. The skin on the backs of his hands had lost the transparency Watson had previously observed. The ritual had worked. It was a fact, and Watson recorded it on a separate line without comment. George Brown was in the yard chopping wood with the same axe he'd used that night to chop the stake from the cemetery fence. Watson approached him and reported his son's condition briefly without detail. Brown listened, nodded, and continued chopping wood. Watson stood nearby for a few seconds, then said there was one more matter that needed to be discussed. Brown stuck the axe into the block and turned around. Watson told him everything, about the mirror, about the signs, about the treatise and the 3 days. He spoke standing, without preamble or mitigating language, because the man had seen enough in the last 2 days to require no mitigating language. Brown listened without interrupting. When Watson finished, the farmer remained silent for a long time. Then he asked what needed to be done. Watson replied that nothing had happened yet, that the procedure described in the treatise was being carried out, and that by the end of the 3rd day it would be clear whether it had worked. He asked Brown for only one thing. If by dawn on the 4th day there was any change in his behavior or appearance, the farmer was to act without hesitation or waiting for permission. He outlined specific signs that would make this obvious. Brown listened and nodded. He didn't ask if this would be difficult. Watson appreciated the silence. He returned to the church by midday and spent the rest of the day there, attending to parish affairs with a thoroughness that was both necessary and a method of control. As long as he could keep records, conduct services, and remember the names of parishioners in the correct order, the process did not take over what the treatise called the center of the will. It was the only self-diagnostic tool available to him, and he used it every hour, testing himself on specific tasks, the sequence of psalms, the names of the parish council members, the contents of the letter to the diocese he wrote on January 21st. A letter to the diocese. He remembered it only now, and spent a few minutes recalling its exact contents. He sent it by the afternoon mail on the 20th, stating the facts without using the word vampire. There was no reply. He didn't expect an answer for at least a week, given the winter roads and the distance to Providence. By then, either the treatise would be proven correct or Brown would already know what to do. On the evening of the 2nd day, what Watson recorded as the 7th sign on the list occurred. He was preparing for the night's vigil, lighting candles and checking the lock on the side door, when he felt hunger. Not the usual hunger of a man who hasn't eaten since morning. This was a different sensation, and he recognized it precisely because it was different. It was directed. It had an object. The object was in the next room, behind the wall, where one of the young clergy had lingered after the evening service to sort out the church vessels. Watson stood by the door between the sacristy and the main hall and heard movement and breathing beyond. He stood there, his hand on the doorknob for about 20 seconds. Then he removed his hand and walked to the opposite wall. He stood with his back to the wall, facing the door, and held the silver cross on his wrist, clenching it in his fist until his palm ached. The pain was useful. The pain brought his attention back to his body, to a specific physical sensation, to the present moment. He stood there until he heard the clerk finish his work, walk through the main hall, and exit through the front door. The sound of the door closing was the most satisfying sound Watson had heard in 2 days. He recorded this observation verbatim and without editing. The 7th sign was confirmed. All 7 out of 7. The treatise was accurate in its diagnosis. It remained to be seen whether it was accurate in its prognosis. Watson spent the second night just as he had the first. Psalter, candles, morning medley, a cross on his wrist. He heard footsteps against the wall 3 times, and the third time, shortly before dawn, they paused at the door longer than usual. He counted 7 minutes before they left. The third day began with him having trouble finding the right page in the Psalter. He leafed through it for a few seconds before remembering he'd been holding a bookmark. The bookmark was where he'd left it. He found the page and began reading. After a few stanzas, he stopped. He reread the last 3 lines twice. Then he closed the book and opened it again to the same page. The letters were still there. The words formed sentences. The meaning was clear, but something had changed as he read, something elusive and important that he couldn't pinpoint. And this very impossibility of pinpointing it was a symptom in itself. He picked up the diary and wrote, "3rd day, morning. All procedures followed." The composition was accepted 3 times. The reflection in the mirror was still missing. He put a period. Then he wrote below separately with a different pen pressure, as if the phrase was written by a different hand. "But I feel myself getting faster." He stared at this phrase for a long time. Then he closed the diary and put it in his bag. He prepared a 3rd mixture, the last one prescribed in the treatise. Silver filings, settling to the bottom of the copper bowl in the heated mixture, formed a thin, shiny layer that, when illuminated at a certain angle, resembled something living. He drank the mixture down. He set the bowl down. He picked up the diary again. And he wrote what he had to write, while he could still write it in his own words, in his own handwriting, with that pressure of the pen that only a person has who understands that the next page may turn out to be the last page he writes in the full sense of the word. If the procedure fails by dawn tomorrow, this diary must be sealed and archived. Not burned, not destroyed, precisely sealed. With the silver clasp he'd removed from his personal prayer book and placed it nearby on the table last night when he'd made this decision, what he knew must remain, not for his sake, for the sake of the next person who would encounter the same thing and who wouldn't have time to search for a 16th century treatise in the seminary library. He closed the journal. He took the silver clasp and twirled it in his fingers. It was cold, as silver always is, but now the cold was more acute than it should have been, and Watson put the clasp back in his pocket, not putting it back on the table. There were 9 hours left until dawn. 9 hours. Watson laid them out before him like a problem with known variables. The Psalter was open to the same page where it had left off that morning. Candles were placed at the same spots around the table. The cross on his wrist was tightened to the same tightness. All external conditions were identical to the previous 2 nights. The only variable he couldn't control was within himself, and it determined the outcome. He began reading the Psalms at 6 o'clock in the evening. The reading was more difficult than the day before. Not because of fatigue, although 2 days without sleep had taken its toll physically, in the form of heaviness behind the eyes and slowed reactions. The difficulty was of a different kind. The words of the text began to require an effort they hadn't required before. Not an effort of understanding, but an effort of retention. It was as if a gap had appeared between what he read and the meaning of it, small, almost imperceptible, but still present. Watson noted this in his diary, using a medical analogy, the gap between a nerve impulse and a muscle response when the pathways are damaged. The function was maintained, the speed was reduced, and the direction was altered a few degrees from normal. Around 8 o'clock in the evening, he heard footsteps. Earlier than on previous nights, much earlier. If they had previously appeared after midnight, now the sun had not yet fully set below the horizon and the sky outside the sacristy window was dark gray, not black. Watson raised his head from the psalter and glanced at the side door. The footsteps moved slowly along the north wall as usual, but today they didn't circle the church's perimeter. They stopped at the side door immediately without going around. The silence behind the door lasted longer than on previous nights. Watson stood up and walked to the opposite wall, holding the cross at arm's length, pointing toward the door. He didn't say a prayer out loud. He breathed evenly and counted the seconds. At the 60th second, fog began to seep from under the door. He recognized it immediately. The same white, the same character of movement, directed and meaningful, the same speed of condensation. The fog was drawn into the sacristy through a crack under the door in a thin, continuous stream and gathered at the threshold into a small, dense cloud. Watson stood against the opposite wall and watched it, motionless. Then the cloud stopped. It didn't dissipate or continue to thicken. It simply stopped about 3 feet from the threshold and hung in the air, a motionless mass. Watson watched it and understood what was happening. The consecrated objects he'd placed around the table formed a barrier. Not physical, not visible, but real. Just as real as everything else in this story. The fog sensed this barrier and couldn't cross it. For several minutes, nothing happened. Then the fog began to recede, slowly, in the opposite direction, toward the crack under the door. Watson watched, holding the cross and not lowering his hands. The fog retreated toward the threshold. It stopped once more. And at that moment, something happened that Watson hadn't expected. Something that took up a whole new paragraph in his diary, written with a different pen pressure, as if his hand had tensed. The fog spoke. Not in the voice of the Mercy Brown he knew alive, not in the voice that might have been easier to bear. The fog spoke with the voice of his mother, who had died 12 years ago, whom he hadn't heard since, and whose voice he remembered with the precision of those he loved. He described the voice in his diary in a single sentence, an exact copy, without a single deviation in timbre or intonation. He didn't write what exactly the voice said. He only wrote that he listened to it for about 30 seconds before he began reading the psalm out loud, deliberately louder than he had ever read in that sacristy, drowning out the voice outside the door with his own. He read without stopping, not allowing himself a pause for his voice to return. He read until the footsteps behind the wall resumed and began to recede. When they faded, he finished the psalm, closed the psalter, and sat down. He sat there for several minutes, holding the silver cross in his fist, his hand still clenched. Then he opened the journal and wrote the following. It's changing tactics. Direct influence through the fog isn't working because of the barrier. Now it's trying to work through the voice. This means the barrier is holding. It also means it's intelligent enough to seek alternatives. He put a period and turned the page. The next 3 hours passed in silence. Watson read, changed candles, got up and paced the sacristy whenever he felt his eyes begin to droop. Around midnight, he brewed a strong tea on an alcohol burner, using the tea leaves he kept in the sacristy for long work nights, and drank 2 mugs in a row. His body reacted to the caffeine more slowly than it should have, which in itself was an observation he recorded in his journal. At 1 o'clock in the morning, the footsteps returned. This time there were 2 of them. Watson heard it immediately because he had been listening to the same footsteps for 2 days and knew their rhythm. Now the rhythm was different. 2, walking at short intervals with the same speed and the same silence. They walked around the entire perimeter of the church, not stopping at the side door. Watson stood in the middle of the sacristy, turning to follow the sound, tracking their progress along the walls. They stopped at the main entrance to the church. Watson walked out of the sacristy into the main hall. The front door was bolted and locked, and above it hung the crucifix he'd hung there the first night. He walked up to the door and pressed his ear to it. Nothing. No breathing, no movement. Just two sets of footsteps standing on the other side of the door in the stillness of the night. He walked away from the door and returned to the sacristy. He picked up the journal and wrote, "There are two of them. This is new. Either the creature has gained the ability to assume multiple forms simultaneously, or one of the deceased members of the Brown family has joined it." The treatise did not rule out the latter option. The treatise explicitly stated that victims who died in a state of affection themselves became undead. Mary Eliza Brown. Mary Olive Brown. Watson put down his pen and looked into the corner of the sacristy, out of the light of the 3 candles. The corner was dark, usually dark. He saw it well enough to be sure it was empty, and that ability to see in the dark, which he'd noted as the 6th sign on the first night, was now useful. There was no one in the corner. The sacristy was empty. Footsteps had been lingering at the front door for about 20 minutes. Then they went their separate ways. Watson tracked both sets along the perimeter walls and confirmed that both had retreated toward the cemetery. He returned to the table. There were about 3 hours left until dawn. At 2 o'clock in the morning, something happened that he hadn't foreseen and that required a different kind of effort from all the previous trials of the night. He sat with the psalter on his lap and reached the psalm he had read at Mercy Brown's funeral service. He recognized it at the first line and paused. He sat over the open page for about a minute, not reading. Then he began reading from the beginning, with the same evenness with which he had read the previous 130 psalms that night. He read it to the end, closed his eyes for a few seconds, opened them again, and moved on to the next one. At 4 o'clock in the morning, the sky outside the sacristy window began to brighten. Watson stood, walked to the window, and looked at the horizon. The gray January dawn, slow and hesitant, was spreading across the sky from the east. In a few minutes, the first direct ray of sunlight would fall on the windowsill. He stood by the window and waited for that moment. He held the silver cross in his right hand and looked at the brightening sky. When the sunlight touched his left hand, resting on the windowsill, he didn't pull it away. He left it there, in the direct light, and waited. There was no burning sensation. He waited another half-minute, shifting his hand so the light fell on his wrist with the cross. The cross had warmed up in the sun, just as metal warms up in the sun, and that was all. No burning beneath the silver, no discomfort. A hand in direct sunlight was just a hand in direct sunlight. Watson stood by the window for a few more minutes. Then he walked over to the mirror that hung next to the wash basin in the corner of the sacristy, where he cleaned his hands before services. He looked into the mirror. His face was there. Watson stared at it for a few seconds, motionless. The gray dawn provided just enough light to see his reflection clearly, deep shadows under his eyes from 3 sleepless nights, a 3-day stubble he hadn't noticed until he saw it in the mirror, a coat collar turned up at one side. The ordinary face of an ordinary, tired man. His own face. He stood in front of the mirror long enough to confirm what he saw. Then he stepped back, sat down on a chair, and rested his hands on the table. His hands weren't shaking. He made a special note of this because it was astonishing. He opened his diary. The treatise had been correct in its diagnosis. The treatise had been correct in its treatment. 3 compositions, 3 nights of vigil, continuous contact with consecrated silver, daily communion. The procedure worked. Watson recorded it with the same matter-of-factness with which a doctor records the successful outcome of a treatment. No celebration, just a statement. He then conducted a full check of all 7 criteria. First, the reflection in the mirror is present, restored. Second, Direct sunlight does not cause discomfort. Checked at a window at 4:15 a.m. Third, sensitivity to the scent of blood has been reduced to normal, as confirmed by the same abrasion on his left hand, which had by now healed. He raised his hand to his face and smelled only the scent of leather and the fabric of his glove. Fourth, absence of instinctive avoidance of sunlight, as confirmed. Fifth, no fine motor retardation. He wrote a sentence in cursive and tested his speed. Sixth, no improved night vision. The dark corner of the sacristy was just a dark corner again. Seventh, no focused hunger with a specific object. All 7 signs eliminated. Watson wrote this and underlined it with a single, even line. Then he turned the page and began his final journal entry, the longest of them all, which he wrote for about 2 hours as the sun rose above the horizon and the light in the sacristy grew brighter. He concluded. The Brown family had been fading for 4 years, beginning in 1888. 3 were dead: the mother, the eldest daughter, and the youngest daughter. All 3 were likely rendered undead by the bond established by the Nosferatu, which used Mercy Brown's body as its primary host. The nature of Mercy's initial infection itself remained unknown. The treatise indicated that Nosferatu could exist in the region for significantly longer than 4 years, changing shells as they became exhausted. Watson wrote that he had no way to check the Baptist Church cemetery's history for anomalous burials in earlier years, and that this would have to be done, but by another person at another time. Edwin Brown survived. The ritual severed the connection before it was fully established. Watson predicted that with normal nutrition and rest, the young man should recover within a few weeks. He wrote Brown Sr. a brief medical recommendation and added one warning. If in the coming months Edwin complained of a damp, earthy smell or an unexplained chill in the room, he was to inform him, Watson, immediately. Nosferatu was destroyed. But the treatise warned that a creature of this type was not always unique in the region. 3 corpses raised by attachment were destroyed along with the primary host at the moment of the heart's burning, as their existence depended on the existence of the one who created them. The treatise was categorical on this point. The death of a Nosferatu sever all derivative attachments simultaneously. Watson verified this assertion in the only way available to him. Edwin was recovering. Indirect confirmation, but sufficient. He finished the last page, closed the diary, and picked up the silver clasp that had been in his pocket since the 3rd morning. He fastened it to the cover, threading it through a loop sewn into the leather binding during manufacturing. The clasp clicked with that dry sound that closes things meant to stay closed. He sat with the closed diary in his hands, looking out the sacristy window. The sun had risen high enough that its direct light fell on the table before him. Watson placed his hand in the sunlight and left it there. He simply left it there, not to test it, but because it felt good. An hour later, he drove to Brown's farm. Edwin was asleep, a real sleep, deep and quiet, without the tension that distinguishes the sleep of the sick from that of the recovering. Brown met Watson in the yard and listened to him in silence, as always. When the priest finished, the farmer asked only one thing. Was it over? Watson replied, yes. Brown nodded and went into the house without adding anything. Watson watched him go, thinking that the man had no words for what had happened to him, and that perhaps that was right. He returned to the church for the midday service. The service proceeded as usual. The congregation took their seats, sang familiar hymns, and listened to familiar words. No one knew what had happened in the last 5 days. No one was supposed to know. Watson stood at the altar and looked at the people before him, at their ordinary faces, at the children fidgeting in the pews, at the elderly dozing in the back rows, and thought about how ordinariness is a privilege that most people accept as the norm. That evening, he wrote a second letter to the diocese. Brief, 3 lines. He stated that the incident described in the previous letter had been resolved and that no further intervention was required. He provided no details. He signed and sealed the envelope. Then he opened his desk and pulled out the first letter, the one he'd written on January 20th and sent by the afternoon mail. It had been lying unopened in a drawer. The postal courier had returned it that same night without explanation. Watson took both letters and burned them in the vestry fireplace. You decided to keep the diary. He wrote about this decision on the separate sheet of paper which he placed inside the cover before sealing the clasp, and which I, a researcher, discovered along with the diary in a sealed folder in the Vatican archives more than 100 years later. The sheet read, "This document contains a description of events that occurred in Exeter, Rhode Island in January 1892. The facts stated are accurate. The methods used work. If you are reading this, you need them. Use them without delay and without doubt. Doubt is more valuable than you think." Below was another line, added with a different pen, clearly later, with the kind of pressure that suggests haste or that the writer's hand was working under time constraints. It read as follows. The treatise does not mention one thing. If you killed the Nosferatu not alone, check everyone who was nearby. Check immediately, not in a day, immediately. I checked myself. I haven't checked Caleb Pratt. I closed the folder and placed it on the table in front of me in the reading room of the Vatican archives. Outside the window was Rome, January, a whitish winter sky above the tiled roofs. I sat with the closed folder in front of me and thought about Caleb Pratt, the former constable from Exeter who held the aspen stake with both hands and didn't look away fast enough when the creature looked at him in the dark crypt. I was thinking that Watson clearly didn't write that last line on the day the case was closed, or the day he printed the clasp. He wrote it later, hastily, like someone who's only just realized something they should have realized sooner. I was thinking about the fact that in the archives of St. Michael's Church in Exeter, which I had studied before my trip to Rome, there was a death record for Caleb Pratt, dated February 1892. The cause of death was listed as pulmonary consumption. I rose from the table, gathered up the papers, and asked the archivist to put the file back in storage. He took it away, and the metal archive doors closed behind him with that quiet click that closes things meant to stay closed. I stepped outside. January. Rome was cold and windless. I stopped on the steps of the archive building and took out the phone book in which I wrote down the contacts of the people I worked with in the field. I needed to call 2 colleagues who were traveling with me to Rome and who were studying other files from the same collection in the next room while I was working on Watson's diary. We needed to discuss the next steps. I found the right number. He brought the phone book closer to better examine the numbers in the January twilight, and stopped. Because in the glass display case of the closed shop across the street, which acted like a mirror in this light, I saw the steps of the archive building, the empty street, pigeons on the ledge opposite, and the gray sky above the rooftops. There was no one on the steps.